Okay, this is about archetypes of place. So, archetypes of place are a little bit easier than character archetypes in some ways because they're a little bit less ambiguous because places tend to have specific characteristics. So, for example, a desert, whether a hot or a cold desert, is usually has sparse vegetation, usually has little life in it, little water, little fruit, little food, little of the things you need for survivability. So that is a desert in a nutshell. Is it's hard to survive, in the desert. Basically, the archetype then of a desert is the place where there isn't life, where there's not a lot of ability to survive, where the people who live there are very hard people. They're very rugged. They learned how to survive through a lot of hardship and toil and intelligence and cunning. So the place sometimes tells us about what we would expect to find in terms of characters in the setting. So that is an archetype of place. I mentioned the city in my intro video to archetypes in general. The city can be a place where there's decadence. It can be a place where there's a lot of people, which can be good or bad. It can be a place of crime. It can be a place of fear. It can be a place of sadness. It can be a happy place because there can be a lot of celebrations, a lot of centers of knowledge like libraries or museums or that sort of thing. There's all kinds of associations with the city. A city can represent progress. A city can represent the lack of progress or regress toward something bad. The city can represent mechanical life as opposed to natural life. So the city can be an archetype of place. Depending on the city, you could have a good archetype or a bad archetype. For example, Augustine in his City of God proposes a city of man and a city of God. You can guess which one was the good city and which one was not so great. The city of God had all these stuff that you would want if you were a Christian, namely, it had God, it had all this good stuff going on, all this moral, upright lifestyle. Whereas the city of man, as you might guess, for Augustine, had like sinful pleasures, had sex and violence, and was slave to money, that sort of idea. So, the city can be a good or bad archetype. The country, I kind of mentioned with the plains, the country in general, as opposed to the city, could be an archetype. So, if you come from a small town, maybe you have family values and people are take life slower and know what really matters, and they have big homemade meals and they welcome you in even as a stranger into their little small town ways, and it's such a quaint little environment that you can learn from as the city slicker and go and become renewed and live a more natural life or whatever. That could be a country archetypal thing. Or you could have a negative country archetype where everybody's a hillbilly and everybody's, out of work and unemployed and underemployed and unhappy with their life. And if they went to the city, they would be happy and they'd have jobs and they'd have prosperity and they'd have education, but they're stuck in this country, rural setting. And, it's, I'm exaggerating, but there can be both a good country archetype and a bad country archetype. For a lot of these things, you'll find that to be the case. Um, I'm not trying to be bigoted, but oftentimes these are just gut reactions that people have to something. They're not necessarily reflected on, except when movie makers are using them, they tend to pick their settings with something specific in mind. So you would have a deliberate choice on the part of the person to represent the country either as good and down home and ideal or bad and hickish and hillbillyish and awful, you could have a deliberate choice as to what the movie maker or story writer was trying to say with that. So that's city versus country. Then you have kind of, well, you can have a lot of places. The jungle. Jungle is a big thing. You have, for example, Lord of the Flies. The jungle represents the darkness at the heart of our being. It's mysterious, it's unknowable. We can't even fathom what we would become if we were left in the jungle. In the Lord of the Flies, we kind of see boys from good English society devolve into savages who are trying to kill each other. So that's kind of the jungle. It could be that sort of darkness, or we have the heart of darkness. Again, the jungle, you get further away from society as we know it, and you become less and less civilized and more barbaric or violent or unruly. And in the case of the jungle, nature tends to be the dog-eat-dog world. Harsh, savage, but also there's a lot of growth, there's a lot of wild things, there's a lot of life in the jungle. It just happens to be savage life. So in contrast to the desert where there's not so much life, the jungle is powerful and teeming with life. There just happens to be wild. So that's an archetype with the jungle. You could have the river as an archetype. A river, you've heard the saying, maybe, you never enter the same river twice. River is always changing, always flowing, always shrinking or getting large. I just avoided saying growing because I didn't want to get poetic on you. So rivers can change course, change shape, change size. You're not necessarily in control on the river of where you're going, but it tends to be going somewhere definitive. If you think about Huck Finn, The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, the river Mississippi really drives a lot of the plot because where they go on the river, how they get to where they're going, they overshoot where they're going in the fog. The river really drives that plot. So river can have a lot of implications like being out of control. Again, there's life. Water always has something to do with life, typically, in art. So whether good or bad, again. But the river can be something. The ocean is another place that really has a profound association with archetypes. Ocean really has a rich history because you can be afraid of the ocean. If you don't have good enough ships, you're going to be scared to sail the ocean. The ocean is going to represent chaos. For example, in the book of Job in the Bible, the Leviathan is this monstrous sea creature and it's chaos. And the waters at the beginning of the book of Genesis in the Bible represent chaos, and the Spirit of God is hovering over the waters and brings forth order out of chaos. So the waters can be chaos, water in the ocean can be infinity. A lot of times in Christian circles, the water is a metaphor for the love of Christ, where you have boundless as the ocean, deeper than the deepest sea, that kind of, wow, this is infinite. Along those lines, that can refer to God. In the Life of Pi, for example, the ocean is arguably archetypal for infinite, and the infinite, by extension, would include God, or would perhaps be embodied by God, being this almighty, infinite, unknowable thing that we have to contend with. So, similar to the book of Job, like I mentioned, God is kind of a force of nature that Job has to deal with. God isn't this God in a box kind of character where you're like, oh, I just have my little Jesus here and I'm going to be okay with that. So, basically, there's that. Other traditions as well have water as some sort of endlessness. If you look at Japanese calligraphy, painting, or drawing, sometimes you will see the scrolls will have these enormous waves. And, there's a whole symbolism that I've seen explained in calligraphy exhibits where, there's related to endlessness or related to, the soul in the face of overwhelming power of nature or that sort of thing. So the Christian tradition certainly isn't the only one with this whole idea of water as unending. Even Friedrich Nietzsche, who didn't put much stock by Christianity, had a metaphor in his work of water as being endless. So, just so you are aware, land would imply stability in this case. So, water versus land, stability versus change. Um, you can also have settings like a volcano, which, there's a lot of destruction, there's a lot of death, there's fire. Fire tends to have its own symbolism of hell or judgment or chaos, that sort of thing. So you can see some of these implications. I'm trying to get you to use your head, and because the world is literally the limit for the types of places you can find. So I'm going to cut it off here because it's gotten pretty long already. I just wanted to give you an overview of Archetypes of Place.